I hadn't planned anything like this, and certainly not with Adrian. But sometimes life takes someone else's brush and paints its own picture. When Adrian asked me to help him during the school year, I didn't think much of it, just asked my nephew to help me in the studio. In his 19 years, Adrian was enthusiastic and eager, and his energy reminded me of what it's like to be young, with the world still weighing on my shoulders. He took up residence in the guest room of my cottage, and it was only supposed to last a few months, until summer came and he went wherever life called him. One rainy afternoon, I set up a canvas in my studio and asked Adrian to pose for me. I hadn't looked at him before, not the way an artist looks at his subject, but that day he sat before me with a look that was far more mature than I remembered. His dark eyes were thoughtful, his shoulders broadened since I had last noticed him. He had become a man without noticing it himself. As I traced the contours of his figure on the canvas, I marveled at his beauty, a beauty that seemed fragile and fleeting. It wasn't just his looks, but the fact that he radiated kindness, curiosity, vulnerability, and I wanted to capture it all. I painted in silence, but something unspoken filled the room. It was the rain gently tapping on the windows. It was the way his eyes followed the movement of my hand, the way the curve of his lips softened into a smile when I asked him not to move. The air between us felt like it was humming, a quiet electric charge in it that neither of us were paying attention to. It was an unspoken connection, both exhilarating and frightening at the same time, as if we were stepping into uncharted territory, not knowing what lay ahead. The feeling was almost palpable, a tension that seemed to grow stronger by the day, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was happening between us. "Are you comfortable, Aunt Lena?" he asked at one point, his voice low and serious, as if we were sharing a secret. I nodded, but inside my heart beat an uncertain rhythm. There was something about the way he looked at me, almost like I was more than just his aunt, more than an artist asking for his patience. It was as if he saw me as a woman, a person with her own hopes and vulnerabilities, and that realization both excited and frightened me. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. Did he see the woman I once was, or the woman I had become? Does he see the longing I tried so hard to hide? Days passed, and I drew him again and again, his back turned to me, his eyes closed, his face half hidden by shadow. He had become my muse, and I could no longer deny that every stroke of the brush was more than just an artist's duty. I wanted to capture every nuance, his laughter, his quiet sadness, the vulnerability he didn't yet know how to hide. Each portrait became a reflection of my growing affection for him, the way his presence seemed to fill empty spaces in my heart that I didn't realize I had. The studio, once a place of solitude and focus, became a place where emotions raged, where every glance, every movement carried a weight that neither of us could ignore. One evening, as I was finishing the final touches on a portrait, he came up behind me, watching me work. His face was so close that I felt his breath on my neck, and I froze. My brush hovered in the air. He put his hand on my shoulder, a simple gesture of connection, but it sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the warmth of his touch seeping through my skin, a warmth that seemed to melt away the barriers I'd carefully built between us. That touch spoke of comfort, of reassurance, but also of something more, something neither of us dared to name. "Lena," he whispered, and my heart clenched at the sound of my name in his voice, at his closeness. I turned to face him, and in that moment it was as if the world had narrowed to the two of us. The studio was gone, the paints, the half-finished canvases. It was just him and me, standing too close, the lines between appropriate and right blurred to the point of disappearing. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words that hung between us, and realized we were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. His eyes sought mine, as if he was asking for permission, as if he was looking for something I wasn't sure I could give. "Adrian," I whispered, and in that word came all the reasons why we shouldn't do this. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers touched my cheek, and I closed my eyes, sinking into the warmth of his touch, even though every voice in my head was telling me not to. It was as if all my resistance crumbled from that one gentle touch, leaving me open and vulnerable to the feelings I'd been denying. I felt tears welling up in the corners of my eyes, but not from sadness, but from an overwhelming desire for something I knew I shouldn't have done. It was a dangerous dance, what we were doing, pushing at the edge of something that could destroy us both. I knew it, he knew it, and yet there was some kind of magnetic attraction between us that neither of us could resist. Every time he walked into the studio, my heart raced, my pulse quickened. Every time he laughed, I smiled without wanting to. It was wrong, and yet it was truer than anything I'd felt in years. The way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to see through the layers I had enveloped myself with, it was intoxicating. I felt that I craved his presence, that he made me feel alive, as if the world was suddenly brighter and full of possibilities. I hadn't realized how lonely I was until Adrian came into my life, until he looked at me like I was something special, something worth loving. And maybe that's what scared me the most, that he saw me, really saw me, in a way no one had seen me in a very long time. He saw me not as an artist, not as an aunt, but as a woman who craved connection, intimacy. And with Adrian, that intimacy seemed natural, effortless, as if we'd always been destined to find each other that way. I had hidden behind my art for so long, using it as a shield to keep the world at bay, but with Adrian I found myself wanting to let it in, to share the parts of myself that I had hidden for so long. But what could I do? He was my nephew, and the world would never understand the quiet longing that grew between us, a love that didn't belong in neat little boxes or under neat labels. It was messy, it was complicated, and it was ours. There were nights when I lay awake, thinking of him in the next room and wondering if he was asleep too, if he felt the same pain I did. The weight of what we were doing, of what we could become, was weighing heavily on me, but the thought that I might lose him, lose that connection, was even more unbearable. I knew the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be judgment, misunderstanding, and pain, but the thought of life without Adrian, without the joy and warmth he brought, was unbearable for me. That night, as we sat on the floor of the studio, surrounded by canvases of his face, his form, he took my hand, threading his fingers through mine. I didn't pull away. I didn't say no to him. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and let myself feel all the things I was trying so hard to ignore. The tenderness in his eyes, the unspoken words that seemed to hang in the air between us, it was all too much, and yet not enough. I saw the love in his eyes, the vulnerability, the hope that maybe we could find a way to be together, despite everything that stood in our way. We sat in silence, the world outside the window quiet, the rain tapping softly against the glass. He moved closer, and I felt the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. I rested my head on his shoulder and closed my eyes when his arm wrapped around me, pulling me even closer. There was something so soothing, so right about his embrace, as if, for once, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. In that moment, all my fears and doubts seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of peace and belonging. As if for the first time in a long time I could just be, without the weight of expectation or fear of judgment. "What are we going to do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, but the weight of the question pressed down on us. He sighed, his lips touching my hair, and I felt his hesitation, his uncertainty. It was a question that had no easy answer, and we both knew it. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose you." His words were raw, honest, and they broke through something inside me, a dam that held back all the feelings I tried so hard to suppress. I knew he was right, that whatever lay ahead, we would have to face it together, that the love we shared was worth fighting for, no matter what it took. I turned my head and looked at him, and in that moment I realized, no matter what happens, no matter what the world thinks of us, I can't let him go. I couldn't walk away from the one person who made me feel alive again. Reaching out slowly, I touched my fingers to his cheek, and he closed his eyes, leaning into my touch. The vulnerability in his expression, the way he seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for my response, made my heart race with a love so deep it was almost overwhelming. "Then we won't," I whispered, my voice trembling, but I was determined. "We'll work this out, Adrian, together." He opened his eyes, and the look in his eyes love made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was a promise, a commitment to face whatever hardships lay ahead, to hold on to each other no matter what. And in that moment I realized that we would find a way out, that our love was strong enough to weather any storm. He leaned in, his forehead pressed against mine, and for a moment we just breathed. The world narrowed to that fragile, beautiful moment. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was fraught with difficulty, but one thing I knew for sure: I wasn't ready to let him go. Not now. Not ever. I knew there would be moments of doubt, of fear, of questioning whether we were doing the right thing, but as long as we had each other, I believed we could face it all. Sometimes life paints an unconventional picture, and maybe that's where the most beautiful stories are born. Stories that are imperfect, that don't fit into neat boxes, but they are bright and vibrant, full of color and passion. And as I sat there with Adrian, our hands intertwined, I knew that our story was just beginning. A story that would be messy and complicated and completely ours. It would be a journey full of ups and downs, moments of pure joy and deep sadness, but it would be ours, and that was enough. And as I looked into Adrienne's eyes, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart.